Well, hello everybody, and welcome to the annual Margaret MacMillan Lecture in International Relations. My name is Nicholas Terpstra. I'm the Provost at Trinity College. And before we open the night's events, I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that the land on which Trinity College and the University of Toronto operates is part of the traditional territories of the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Mississaugas of the Credit and Anishinaabe people, land covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant. We acknowledge the stewardship of this land by First Nations, the continuing presence here of Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and the harm caused by colonialism. And we commit ourselves to seeking a new and honorable relationship with the First Peoples of this land. I would like to thank you for joining us this evening for Trinity College's Margaret MacMillan Lecture in International Relations, named in honor of the former Trinity Provost, the 13th Trinity Provost, the eminent historian of international relations, Margaret MacMillan, who is here with us tonight. And tonight's lecture is made possible through the generous support of various foundations and sponsors. Since the inception of the Margaret MacMillan Lecture in International Relations, we have been fortunate to host some of the most incredible academics of our time, and tonight is no exception. And I'd now like to invite Professor Tim Sale, Director of our International Relations Program, to the stage to introduce tonight's speaker.
Great. Thank you, Provost, and it's my great pleasure not to welcome Professor Hett to U of T, but to welcome him back. Professor Hett actually has 2 degrees from the University of Toronto. He studied law here and practiced law in Toronto before returning to U of T to take an MA in history, where I think the history bug bit even deeper. He then went on to complete his PhD at Harvard University. Professor Hett has taught at Harvard College and the Harvard Law School, and for over 20 years, he's taught history at Hunter College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Now, Hett is an accomplished historian and a scholar in the truest sense, and indeed this afternoon he led a terrific seminar for a number of our students as they examined the practice of history and the challenges of studying controversial events. But I'd add, just as important to these scholarly credentials, which includes numerous awards and distinguished fellowships, is Professor Hett's ability to write for a public audience, to write books that are meaningful for scholars in the ivory tower, but share this history far beyond its walls. And many of his books touch on those critical periods of the 20th century, and I'll read you some titles here, even if the titles give you chills up your spine to a certain degree. The Death of Democracy, Hitler's Rise to Power and the Downfall of the Weimar Republic. The Nazi Menace, Hitler, Churchill, Roosevelt, Stalin, and the Road to War. And his other books like Burning the Reichstag and Crossing Hitler. So I think you get a sense here that Hett's historical subjects are, of course, extremely important moments of the past, but they're also so crucially important for what they might say about today's world. So with that, please join me in welcoming Benjamin Carter Hett to Trinity College. Thanks. Thanks so much, Ben. Thanks a lot.
Well, thank you very much, Tim, for that incredibly kind introduction. Thank you, Provost Terpstra, also for bringing me to this event. I cannot put into words, really, what a thrill it is for me and what an honor to be able to be here. I'm just incredibly grateful for this opportunity as a proud 2-time graduate of this great university. And as a massive fan of Professor MacMillan and her work, and I've been a huge fan of her work ever since I first came across her brilliant book on the Paris Peace Conference from 20 plus years ago, and I've read almost all of her books. Since then, I learned last night I'm missing the one on Stephen Leacock, so I'm going to make that up pretty soon. And I had a fabulous time ever since I've been here. I got here early yesterday. Everyone has been so kind and so welcoming. I've had the chance to meet Professor MacMillan. We had corresponded before, but we hadn't personally met. She's been so kind and welcoming. I had a fabulous time with the students today at the seminar that was arranged. That was also a joy. A good indication of just how great the academic programs here, I think, are at Trinity College. So again, thank you all for everybody, and it's such a thrill for me to be here. There's one other person I want to mention since I'm here at the University of Toronto, where I've spent so many years. When I was a law student here in the 1980s, I became close friends with a fellow student named Sheldon Hamilton. And Sheldon and I went through all the things you go through when you're young and you're doing something like being in law school, and then we ended up working at the same law firm downtown for a few years. And we went through all the life stuff you go through when you're in your 20s. Sheldon was also a two-time graduate of the University of Toronto Engineering and Law, and he became one of Canada's top patent lawyers, mixing those skills. He also was a good advertisement for the education of the University of Toronto. Sheldon was a very broadly curious, intellectually curious person. He loved to travel, and he loved history. We used to talk about history quite a bit. Sheldon died 2 months ago, far too soon, far too young. And certainly I will miss him, as I think all of his friends and colleagues from law school and from the profession will miss him. I think there are at least a couple here tonight, and I know they will share my feelings that we miss him. So I want to actually dedicate my remarks tonight to Sheldon's memory. So my title is, What Can We Learn from 1933? Another look at rhyming history. The first part of that obviously refers to one of the major events of 1933, the coming to power of the National Socialist regime in Germany under Adolf Hitler. And the second part refers to a famous quote, perhaps apocryphal, from Mark Twain, that history doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme. What this gets us to is the difficult question of how you can draw lessons from history, or whether you can draw lessons from history at all. Are we hearing those rhymes correctly or not? And this is actually very difficult to do. It seems to have become my job description for some reason in the last 10 years or so, given my nerdy specialty on the last years of the Weimar Republic and the first years of the Nazi regime. But that said, I must say that trying to draw lessons from history is much harder than many people think it is. And I want to start by just saying a couple of words about that. When I was actually starting as a graduate student here back about 1.5 million years ago, one of the first things I read was a mordantly funny text by the Harvard historian Ernest May. And Ernest May told a story about really how not to learn lessons from history. And he provided a narrative sort of across the 20th century of statesmen serially drawing the wrong lessons from historical experience. His story really started in the aftermath of the First World War, after which many statesmen across the world drew the lesson that the war had been a colossal mutual blunder. It had been a terrible accident. No one had willed it. No country, no leader had been purposefully aggressive, but it had been a case of mutual failure of communication. So among the statesmen who took this lesson was the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain. He took, I think, very much to heart something that had been said by Britain's World War I Prime Minister David Lloyd George, by the way, the great-grandfather of Professor MacMillan. David Lloyd George had written in his memoirs, speaking of the outbreak of war in 1914, the nations slithered over the brink into the boiling cauldron of war, this idea of it being a mutual, unwilled blunder. So Neville Chamberlain decided, when faced with the challenge of Hitler in the late 1930s, the obvious answer was to go and meet the man and look him in the eye and hammer out an agreement. And clear communication surely could solve all of the world's problems. And so to this end, Chamberlain flew to Germany and met Hitler personally on 3 occasions in September 1938. He wrote to his sisters, which he did weekly. It's a great source. He said he had looked Hitler in the eye and he had seen a man who could be counted on to keep his word when he had given it. Now, spoiler alert, This actually turned out not to be true. And World War II came less than a year after Chamberlain had written these words. So, you start to see that drawing historical lessons is a little bit difficult to do. Then came World War II, and then came the aftermath of World War II, and then by this time the historical lessons seemed to have changed. Now the historical lesson, statesmen of the world said, was, oh, I see, okay, no, you don't appease a relentless, aggressive power. You stand up to the relentless, aggressive power at the first move. So any future dictator making a move on a sort of metaphorical Rhineland, you stop them there, or before you know it, they will be in a metaphorical Austria or a metaphorical Sudetenland, or eventually a metaphorical Poland. So in the service of this idea, the United States found itself fighting pointless but highly destructive wars in places like Korea and Vietnam. And just to sort of drive home the point, Professor May wrote of a moment in 1965 when Lyndon B. Johnson was considering sending large numbers of American troops to Vietnam. And Johnson spoke of the lessons of Munich. He said, we learned at Munich, from Chamberlain's experience at Munich, that you must stop aggressors right away, and if you let them proceed with aggression, then they will just keep coming back at you. So the image of Hitler grafted onto North Vietnam was actually not much more successful than the image of Hitler had been grafted onto North Korea a decade or so before, and indeed not much more successful than the image of the July crisis of 1914 had been grafted onto the international politics of the 1930s. So again, this is very difficult to do, this business of trying to learn from history, or at least learn accurately from history. So now here we are in the autumn of 2025, I'm sorry. I think maybe I wish we were in 1925. With Donald Trump now at about the 9-month mark of his second term, Trump has, I haven't totally been keeping up on the news in the last day, but I think there have been more alarming developments. But Trump is sending troops to various American cities. He has indicated that he thinks broadcasters who broadcast programs that criticize him should lose their license. His ICE immigration police are notorious for the brutality and the cruelty with which they are rounding up migrants. There seems just about no doubt that he is trying to impose an authoritarian regime on the United States. He has, of course, made threats of aggression towards various countries, including Venezuela, Greenland, and, of course, Canada. The question is, how much here are we getting echoes of 1933? And if we are, what can we learn from them, and what can we do about it? It's worth adding as well that out there in the world, which is something that Americans, I think, pay only fitful attention to, there are right-wing authoritarian inclined parties who may very soon be in power in such core democratic countries as France, Germany, even Great Britain. So this is an urgent problem. It's an urgent problem for our time, how we think about authoritarianism. As Professor MacMillan said last night, history maybe can't allow us to predict, but perhaps it can allow us to understand some of the predicament that we're in if we try and do it humbly and judicially. So this is what I want to talk about now, where this historical lesson gets us in the situation we are in now. Given what I do for a living and given some of the books I have written, hardly a day goes by when someone doesn't ask me, Ben, is this our Reichstag fire moment? Or we get variations on this. Sometimes it'll be, depending on the historical sophistication of the questioner, Ben, is this our Night of the Long Knives? Or is Mitch McConnell our DNVP leader? Or my particular favorite actually is Charlie Kirk our Horst Wessel? They're the parallel I think tracks fairly closely. And the more I hear this, the more I've started to think, this reminds me of something. I remember in a Russian history course reading about when Vladimir Ulyanov, better known as Lenin, led the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in 1917. He and his fellow Bolsheviks were very, very historically literate people. They knew the history of the French Revolution forwards and backwards. And very importantly, they felt the French Revolution had established an immutable historical script This is how a revolution unfolds. The phases of the French Revolution are how a revolution will go, how it must go. And so the Bolshevik leaders spent a lot of time looking over their shoulder wondering, is this our Thermidor? Or is one or another charismatic and ambitious general, is this our Napoleon? There was, in fact, by the way, a pretty plausible Napoleon candidate among them, but he wasn't a general and he had zero charisma, and so their historical eye did not detect him until it was too late. I think there's a lesson there, too, about the accuracy with which the historical eye may perceive things when you are looking for historical analogies. So there is a funny thing about this, and I'm going to throw some historian jargon at you. Historians sometimes speak of determinism or of deterministic theories. And what they mean by this is some theory which says that history must unfold in a certain way or through a certain set of steps and not some other way. I think without doubt the most famous and influential and consequential deterministic theory that historians have used is Marxism, the ideas of Karl Marx, who of course said that history must proceed through stages based on class struggle, and then you see regimes evolving out of this class struggle, and particularly importantly, there's a point at which a medieval feudal society must experience what he called a bourgeois revolution and then transition into a society featuring liberal democratic politics and a liberal capitalist economy, and then eventually there would be a socialist revolution which would lead to a utopia, and at that point he basically stopped theorizing. And just as an example of how following such a paradigm can lead you into curious situations, in my particular business, the business of German history, for many years there was a school of thought, particularly from historians of a Marxist bent, that Germany must have had a bourgeois revolution. It must have had a point at which something like that happened. But the problem is, a bourgeois revolution is supposed to lead you to liberal democratic politics, and that doesn't seem to have happened in Germany in the 19th century. So what do we make of this? So a lot of very brilliant scholars, including my PhD advisor, by the way, spent a lot of time trying to find a bourgeois revolution there somewhere, because there has to be one, because Marx said there has to be one, so it's got to be there. And they came up with often brilliantly inventive answers to the puzzle of where Germany's bourgeois revolution was. But it seems to me you could cut to the chase and just look empirically at what actually did happen and say, okay, this is interesting and important, but perhaps you don't need the framework necessarily that is imposing a kind of Procrustean bed on it, but that might be a debate for another time. Another version of deterministic theories, almost an opposite version, is old-fashioned Whig history. That's Whig with an H. This was a theory much beloved by particularly British historians of the 19th century, and most of the famous Whig historians were Brits of the 19th century, and they tended to see the endpoint of history as something that looked a lot like Britain in the 19th century. And then there was a sort of late gasp of this kind of thinking relatively recently. In the 1980s, the American scholar Francis Fukuyama wrote a book called The End of History. Now, Francis Fukuyama was a scholar living in America in the 1980s, and he postulated the end of history looked remarkably like America in the 1980s. In other words, history ends with the triumph of liberal democratic politics and liberal capitalism. Now, another spoiler alert, it seems that there have been people who didn't get that memo. So since the late 1980s, such folks as Osama bin Laden or Vladimir Putin or Donald Trump do not seem to have gotten the memo that history ended with the triumph of liberal democratic politics. So again, this is something that is particularly hard to do. It seems to me that somehow history is still happening, and so it seems to me we need to go back and look at what is happening and try to understand what's in front of our eyes. It's humanly very difficult. I believe George Orwell said it's the most difficult thing to try and look at the world you're living at and actually see it. But I do think that history is, in some ways, a guide to this. And I actually hope that on the basis of what I've been saying up till now, you have not concluded that historians can offer no wisdom whatsoever, because clearly they do nothing but get it wrong or look for things that aren't there. And I actually do not want to convince you of that. not least because I've been making my living as a historian for nigh on 30 years, and I'd like to keep on doing so, Trump notwithstanding. But also I do think that there is a value in this exercise, and that if we try and observe clearly, and if we try as best we can as human beings to remove prejudices from our minds and perhaps think without the Procrustean beds of precedent, perhaps there are things that we can learn that will tell us something important about where we are. So I want to talk a little bit now about the thing I actually know a little bit about, which is Germany in the late 20s and early 30s, and look a little at why, with the eyes of 2025 in particular, I think, we might see things that stand out and are important to us about the process by which Hitler and the Nazis came to power. I want to start with the question of why some Germans, I think it's important to say some and not all, why some Germans voted for the Nazis in free elections when they had a choice. I think this is a fundamental point. It's a fundamental point to consider, why would you choose this when it is a free choice? Why would you choose this regime where we know what the outcome is? Why would you freely choose this? And this is a point on which there has been considerable controversy among historians. But I venture to say that if you look carefully at what the Nazis said in election campaigns and then where they got votes, there are patterns that emerge fairly clearly which tell us something about the motivation of their voters. The Nazi Party was formed in 1919, and then it was reformed by Hitler early in 1920. But electorally, it got absolutely nowhere until the late 1920s. And then it started to break through in particularly northern and eastern Germany, rural areas, generally heavily Protestant in terms of the religious affiliation of people. And there were several reasons for this. These were areas that had borne the brunt of the First World War, particularly in terms of casualties, because the German army, like most armies of the First World War, was structured in such a way that you generally had an officer corps coming from middle or upper middle class families, and the enlisted men generally came from rural areas, or disproportionately from rural areas, because young men from urban areas were generally workers, often skilled workers, and you needed them to stay home to make the things for war. So it's the farm boys who got sent to war, and so they disproportionately accounted for the casualties. So that was one aspect of the experience of places like rural northern and eastern Germany, which fueled resentment of particularly Berlin, the place where people seem to have been very sheltered from the consequences of the war. The other thing was that there was a crisis happening in rural areas at this time, largely because the grain-growing areas that had opened up in the New World, not least in Canada, and certainly not least in my homeland of Alberta, was putting a huge volume of much cheaper grain onto the market, and German farms, like most European farms, couldn't compete. And so this was causing a crisis of bankruptcy, of rural unemployment in these rural agricultural areas, and understandably enough, this led to bitter resentment of the system under which they were living. The Nazis were the first party to really focus on these issues, and in particular, the Nazis were the first party to talk about what we would today call globalization. They didn't use the word back then, but it's very clear that's what they're talking about. And it's very clear that they were positioning themselves as nationalist champions against globalization, nationalist champions who would defend Germans who were being victimized by the world economy and by world politics and by migration flows against all of those things. And there are many examples I could give you of this. I have a couple of sort of favorite quotes. The very shrewd and talented Nazi propagandist Joseph Goebbels wrote an editorial in his newspaper, which was called The Attack, or Der Angriff, in 1932, in which he said, and I quote, "Do we want to build a wall around Germany? Yes, we want to build a wall, exclamation point." I'm just the messenger. What he meant was build a wall economically around Germany, a wall of tariff barriers, for instance, but also a wall that would limit immigration. The politics of immigration was a big deal in Weimar Germany because Germany could not control its new eastern border with Poland. Germany did not have the manpower, military manpower, or police manpower to stop the massive migration flows that were coming across that border, mostly fleeing violence in Russia / the new Soviet Union. And this was a very emotive issue for the political right. And so this is to an extent what Goebbels was talking about. Then there's a fascinating passage written by Adolf Hitler in the book he wrote as a sequel to Mein Kampf, which was given the imaginative title Hitler's Second Book. And in Hitler's second book, which he didn't publish in his time, but what he wrote there is highly indicative of his thought process. There's an amazing passage, I have to say, a rather surprisingly astute passage, in which Hitler complains about the effects of German companies outsourcing jobs to China. And he says, this is something that is good for the companies in terms of profits and in terms of getting cheap labor, but it will be very bad for Germans and it will be very bad for all Europeans unless they find a way to combat this. And again, the idea that the Nazis will be the party that will combat this kind of activity. Underneath all of this was one, I think, quite serious point. Many Germans of all kinds felt they had been humiliated by the Allies of World War I, particularly through the Treaty of Versailles, but also through a lot of the post-war arrangements, financial, economic, trade, military, and what have you. Young Germans felt humiliated by the fact that they really couldn't make their way in a very difficult post-war economy in conditions where there had been a baby boom in Germany between 1900 and 1910. So there were very large numbers of young people trying to get educational places, trying to get jobs, trying to get apprenticeships when the economy was more or less permanently in crisis. And so that led to feelings of humiliation. And those rural areas I was talking about also experienced a certain amount of humiliation, particularly vis-a-vis Berlin, which to them symbolized everything they hated. I think as someone who's lived in New York for a very long time, you can drop New York right into that, because the things that Germans said about Berlin, or I should say rural or right-wing Germans said about Berlin around 1925 or 1930, track very closely on what conservative rural Americans say about New York. Germans looked upon Berlin as a left-leaning city, a city very diverse. They would see it as not really German. It had a religious mixture, an ethnic mixture, quite diverse by German standards of the time. And so there was a lot of resentment of this domineering big city. A fairly typical dynamic, I think, in most countries, actually. I think there are many countries in the world, not just Americans vis-a-vis New York, but I hate to tell you nice people this, but out there in Canada, there are a lot of people who don't say nice things about Toronto. I can speak to this as an Albertan. Not me, I assure you. I love Toronto, and if I ever come back to Canada, this will be where I would want to live. But I can tell you, out there, Toronto evokes a bit of the feeling that New York evokes in America or that Berlin evoked in Germany. So, interesting set of parallels. But this point of Germans feeling humiliated, I think, is very important, because what the Nazis were offering, in a way, was pride. They're offering a restoration of pride, which was deeply compelling to a lot of these people. And I've actually come to think from my work that humiliation may be the most dangerous political emotion. People who feel humiliated, I think, are more likely to respond in politically radical or even violent ways. That humiliation, I think, is an important spark. Now, these points about anti-globalization and humiliation intersected very fatefully with the German party system. So I want to take a quick look at that and what German politics looked like around 1933. This was a time of very fierce and very bitter partisan division between the political parties of Germany, much like what we see in the United States today, for instance, except geometrically more complicated, because there were about 7 or 8 major parties in the Weimar political system who won significant numbers of seats. Basically, all of them hated all of the others. All of them spoke for very distinct and specific social milieus, and they spoke only for those distinct and specific social milieus. And the system gave them no incentive to try, so to speak, to cross the aisle. They knew they would never get the voters of the other party because the demographic was just too different. And they even were often not given any respect for trying to be conciliatory. There are examples of politicians who made some deal with another party for the greater good, and then the party that is the beneficiary of the deal turns around and says to them, "It's shameful how you betray your principles. I pity the voters who vote for you when you betray them like this." So the incentive to try and cooperate and make deals was close to nil. In this atmosphere, the Nazis burst. And as I said earlier, electorally, on the national stage at least, they got nowhere. until the end of the 1920s. They started breaking through in state elections in rural and northern Germany around 1927, 1928. In the 1928 national election, they gained only 2.3% of the vote, so they're still nowhere on the national level. Then suddenly, 1930, 18.1%. They have jumped up to being the second biggest party in the German parliament, the Reichstag. And so with that, I want to go to a couple of pretty pictures. This, by the way, just gives you, I like showing this to my students to horrify them. This gives you a graphic idea of the political churn in administrations of the Weimar Republic. These are all the chancellors and all the administrations of the Weimar Republic. Depending how you count the first and the last, there can be definitional questions. You have, arguably 21, arguably 22. There'll be a test later. I'm expecting you to memorize all of this. These are the parties. They're all color-coded, much like in the United States, except the color coding is more complicated because there are more of them. And intuitively, unlike the United States, like everywhere else in the world, conservatives are blue and the left is red. I want to just draw your attention to the term at the bottom, political confessions. There are political scientists and historians have picked this up who have talked about this concept of political confessions, and it offers a useful way to understand a deeper reality of Weimar politics. The idea here is that politics works kind of like religious faith. It's something that is sort of bred into you in a community. You pick up your politics like you do your religious faith from your family, from your community, maybe from coworkers, maybe from where you live, whatever the variables might be, and then it tends to be passed on from generation to generation. And scholars have identified only three main political confessions in Weimar Germany, which kind of amalgamated the parties, or amalgamated some of the parties. So the largest, starting from the bottom there, the largest numerically was what's called the middle-class Protestant confession. And it included within it a number of conservative and liberal parties whose common element was that their demographic base was somewhere in the Protestant middle or upper middle classes. In the middle there, you have the Catholic segment. There were in Weimar mainly two parties, one large, one fairly small, whose only mission in politics was to represent German Catholics who generally felt themselves to be a put upon minority in a country that was two-thirds Protestant. And then there's the Socialist confession. This consists basically of people who were urban industrial workers, and they voted either for the relatively mainstream and moderate Social Democratic Party, which was center-left, or the more extreme far-left Communist Party, which was one of the innovations in Weimar Germany, that there was such a party. Now I'm going to show you a slide which I love because I think in this one visual image you get a kind of punch that shows us what the real story was in the politics of the Weimar Republic. What this shows us is these color bands are all the various main political parties of the Weimar Republic. We're here going from bottom to top, we're going from left to right. So at the bottom, the sort of red and orangey ones are the parties of the Socialist Confession. The black and the purple next to the black, those are the parties of the Catholic Confession. And then everything up from there is the parties of the Protestant Middle Class Confession. Now, the Nazis, or the NSDAP as the abbreviation of their full name was, they are symbolically color-coded brown. I always get a kick out of those UPS ads that say, "What can brown do for you?" Because if you're a historian of Germany, that has a really ominous ring to it. But the real story here, you see that kind of funnel shape where brown starts to expand from 1930 on. And this is the real story of Weimar politics, actually. That the Nazis, what they really do is they take over and crush the Protestant middle class confession. That's the real story. They make comparatively few inroads into the other groups. They make comparatively few inroads into Catholic voters and comparatively few inroads into working class voters who are confessionalized towards the socialists or the communists. But they basically completely take over the Protestant middle class group, which again tells us something useful about the Nazis and who they were, or at least who their voters were. Protestant identity is really important here. Middle class identity is really important here. And this correlates with the kind of messaging that the Nazis were giving. It correlates with the geography of where they got votes, especially those northern and eastern rural Protestant, particularly Prussian regions. And so when we think about trying to understand why the Nazis could get support, why a politician like Adolf Hitler could get support, this tells us what was happening politically, who was moving to the Nazis, who wasn't, and how that support worked. And I think it's important to bear in mind that the best the Nazis did in a free election was about a third of the vote. So sometimes you will hear people, I think, sort of sloppily say, oh, Hitler, sort of hypnotized all the Germans into voting for him. He was wildly popular, blah, blah, blah. He was not wildly popular when there were free elections, or at least his party was not wildly popular when there were free elections. 1/3 is the best they got. That made them, in 1932 and 1933, the biggest party in terms of vote share and seat share in the Reichstag. But they were a good long way from a majority. And very importantly, I want to stress this point, there was always an alternative coalition. There was always a big coalition that could have kept them from power, but didn't because of those divisions that we've talked about between all the various parties. The most important of those divisions was between the two arms of the left. The Social Democrats and the Communists really bitterly hated each other, and that hatred had understandable roots. It was rooted in a lot of the violence of the revolutions of 1918 and 1919, which had brought a democratic and social democratic-led regime to power in place of the Kaiser's quasi-authoritarian system. But in the course of that, the communists had tried to push the revolution further to the left, and the socialists had fought back. The violence was considerable, and the bloodshed among communists was quite high. And that cemented the bitterness and the hatred between the two arms of the left, which was fateful because through a lot of the Weimar Republic, those parties together had commanded a majority. And if they could have worked together, that alone could have kept the far right from succeeding. There was another problem in that the communists, like all communist parties in the world in those days, were essentially under the orders of Joseph Stalin in Moscow, who was treated as the boss of all world communists. And Stalin thought that the Nazis coming to power would be good for communists because the horror of a Nazi regime would then precipitate the final stage of a communist regime that would bring the party that he backed to power. So he gave quite explicit orders to the German communists that they were not under any circumstances to work with the Social Democrats in any kind of coalition arrangement. So you see Russian meddling in the politics of Western democracies is not actually a new thing. I think, though, Stalin was kind of icing on the cake here. I think actually the bitterness of the divisions between the socialists and the communists was already sufficient to probably keep them from working together for the foreseeable future of the Weimar Republic. I think that a couple other things are important to understand about the Nazis and how they took power. I'm going to venture into, for the historians out there, slightly more controversial territory. The first thing I want to say is that Hitler had, in my view, a pretty clear idea of how he was going to get power, and then a pretty clear idea of what he wanted to do when he got that power. He wanted to make Germany economically autonomous, make it food and energy secure, as we would say today. His longer-range plan for how to do that involved conquering huge chunks of territory, mostly in the western parts of the Soviet Union. This would make Germany into a superpower which could then compete with the ocean-spanning empires of Britain and America on even terms, or perhaps better than even terms, so that with this Eastern conquest behind him, Hitler felt he could face the prospect of war with the Western capitalist democracies with good chances of winning. He articulated this vision pretty clearly through a long part of his political career. I don't think there's too much doubt that this is what he was aiming for. Always flexible about tactics in the short term, but always pretty clear on the longer range goal. And he also, as I said, in my view, was pretty clear about how his party could get power and how they would consolidate power. And this is where I want to come to the story of the Reichstag fire. This is probably the most important and probably the most controversial element of how it was that Hitler came to power. What happened here is that on the 27th of February, 1933, when Hitler had been in office exactly 4 weeks, a fire broke out in the Reichstag, Germany's parliament building, right at the center of Berlin. There were several smaller fires that did no damage, but the fire that really did the damage was in the plenary chamber where the deputies met, and the fire basically destroyed the plenary chamber. Right away, there was some contention about who had done it. Hitler's government said immediately this was the beginnings of a communist coup d'etat against his administration, and he got his nominal boss, the Reich President Paul von Hindenburg, to immediately pass a decree known as the Reichstag Fire Decree, which did two important things. It put an end to all civil liberties and individual freedoms in Germany, things like freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, freedom from arbitrary arrest. Sometimes overlooked, but arguably more important, it allowed Hitler's Reich, or national government, to take over Germany's state governments. Germany is a federation, was and is, like Canada. And the decree gave him the power to take over the state governments if they were, in his view, not fulfilling their obligations to keep order, which indeed is something that followed very quickly on the coming of the Reichstag Fire Decree. Hitler took over the state governments, including some that were quite oppositional toward him, notably the state of Bavaria. So the Reichstag Fire Decree is often seen as the key moment in the consolidation of his dictatorship. One scholar, the noted legal scholar Ernst Fraenkel, called it the constitutional charter of Hitler's Reich. We know that found in the building and having something to do with the fire was a rather odd young man, a 24-year-old journeyman stonemason named Marinus van der Lubbe, who was arrested, covered in soot, sweating, naked to the waist, yelling, "Protest, protest." And van der Lubbe claimed very proudly sole credit. He said he had burned the thing down by himself and he wanted the credit for it. No one in 1933 believed him. The Nazis insisted he was just part of a communist coup. Van der Lubbe had, in fact, been a member of the Dutch Communist Party. Anti-Nazis just assumed, on the principle of who benefits, that the Nazis had set the fire to enable them to have a pretext to pass their decree, which consolidated their dictatorial rule. I think a reasonable enough proposition logically. This much is all uncontested, but from here on, it gets controversial because the debate has continued now for almost a century. No one thinks the communists did it anymore, but basically the two positions in the debate about the Reichstag fire are either van der Lubbe really did do it by himself, as he claimed, or he was somehow a stooge in a Nazi conspiracy. Full disclosure, I am sort of a partisan in this debate. I wrote a book about 10 years ago arguing largely on the basis of recently available evidence that the Nazis in fact did do it. I have to say this has met with something less than universal agreement, and the controversy remains. This was the subject of the seminar I had today with the terrific students, and I think the controversy always will remain. I personally feel I found what I think is the right answer, but no one need agree with me necessarily, and many don't. So, but there is a sort of broader point to this controversy, because if you think the Nazis set fire to the Reichstag, then you're likely to see it, as in fact I do, as part of a fairly calculated idea about how they could outmaneuver their political opponents and grab dictatorial power. A bit more historian jargon for you. We call people like that, people like me, intentionalists. In the sort of big picture theoretical debates in scholarship on Nazi Germany, there are kind of two camps. There are the intentionalists, and then if you're not an intentionalist, you're probably a functionalist. Functionalists are people who think that Hitler wasn't all that great at making plans or didn't make any, and that things happened in Nazi Germany largely out of chaos, often out of administrative competition, administrative chaos, different agendas, different plans. And so the regime sort of operated a bit like a runaway train with no really clear guiding scheme, and it sort of just bumped its way along from policy to policy. And if you think that, you are very likely to think that van der Lubbe set fire to the Reichstag by himself, and then the Nazis kind of improvised a response, but they didn't know what they were doing. So the debate actually does have some significance as a debate that kind of boils down into one little bit, a fairly big and I think important question about understanding the Nazis and how they got power. Now, people who are intentionalists also think that Hitler had this sort of clear and sweeping blueprint for how he would get power, and in particular leading to a war, and in particular leading to a war and to other things which would cause enormous loss of life. And Hitler took this with great sanguinity. He didn't care much about loss of life. There's an often quoted story that during the Second World War, when fighting was ongoing on the Eastern Front, his military advisors handed him a casualty report, which was very high, and they expected Hitler to be horrified. And Hitler simply shrugged and said, "That's what the young men are there for." I think you can potentially read this as part of the ruthlessness with which he contemplated his plans altogether. But with that, I'm going to sort of move towards the end of my remarks here, but as I move to the end, let me get down to brass tacks about what I think we can really take away from these historical lessons in terms of understanding where we are in 2025. So I'm going to now talk fairly explicitly about what this chapter in history tells us about particularly where the United States is right now. So the first thing I'll say is that I think the reasons that Trump got people to vote for him track pretty closely on the reasons for support of the Nazis in the late 20s and early 30s. There's the element of standing as a national champion against globalization, and there is, I think, very importantly, the element of humiliation. A friend of mine, a noted American political commentator named Alan Elrod, has written, I think, very cleverly about this, and he has said that Trump's real card is status anxiety, and people vote for him out of status anxiety because they feel their status in the society they have known is slipping away. Others who don't deserve status are rising past them, and Trump positions himself as the antidote to this and as the salvation of pre-existing status arrangements. That seems highly plausible to me for America now, and I also think that offers a fair bit of insight or a fair bit of explanation on why Hitler appealed to the voters he appealed to as well. There's a part of this, too, has to do with religion, and I've stressed the fact that Nazi support came very disproportionately from German Protestants who, among the things they didn't like about the democracy of the Weimar Republic was that, as a scholar or colleague of mine put it bluntly but forcefully, Weimar was both too Catholic and too Jewish. And Protestant voters wanted to return to something more like Imperial Germany, which was a very expressly and resolutely Protestant state. And this is, again, part of that status anxiety, I think, and part of why they turned to the Nazis. Trump clearly wants to be a dictator. I think this gets clearer with every passing day. He wants to use the justice system to pursue prosecutions against people he deems his enemy. He wants to use American troops against American civilians in American cities, a training ground against the inner enemy, as he has put it recently. He wants to consolidate power in the federal government under his sole authority, and here he has significant allies along the American right who are adherents of what is called the unitary executive theory, under which it's a constitutional theory which says the president should control the entire executive branch and there shouldn't be any autonomous agencies in the executive branch, and you can see them carrying this out these days. This all tracks to an extent on what Hitler was doing, although I would say it probably tracks to an extent on any authoritarian government. And actually, none of those parallels strike me as being particularly compelling, especially, ironically, the use of soldiers, because that was something that Hitler really didn't do and promised the generals he wouldn't do it. And the German generals were very happy that Hitler promised not to make them deploy troops domestically. And it's one of the reasons that they were willing to line up behind him and allowed him to consolidate support among the military command, because the last thing they wanted was to be parties in a civil war. Since people always ask me, is this our Reichstag fire moment, I think it's worth pondering if you could even have a Reichstag fire moment in 2025, and I'm not sure you could. I think key to the Reichstag fire 1.0 is that the Nazis had already by that time near complete control of the media, so they could control information flow, at least domestically. There were some quite noted foreign correspondents around who caused the Nazis a few headaches by their reporting to their home markets, but at least that was for foreign consumption, not for domestic consumption, which of course makes it a little easier to hide information you don't want. The Nazis also had complete control of the police at that time, and they had influence, although something less than complete control over the judiciary. So they were able to more or less stage manage the process of rounding up suspects for the fire and trying them and getting a little bit close to an outcome they wanted, although I won't get into all the complexities here, but my book on the subject deals with a lot of the complexities of how the Nazis faced this trial and how it didn't always go the way they wanted. Nonetheless, it seems, although we can't do opinion polling, it seems that probably most Germans believed the Nazi narrative about a communist set fire, and it sort of did what the Nazis needed it to do. It's hard to imagine that happening in today's media environment. There would be a deluge of different stories coming out on social media and all the various avenues we have for getting information these days. Trump does not have control of the judiciary, at least anywhere other than the Supreme Court, and on the whole, depending where, doesn't have control of the police. So it's much harder to imagine a sort of successful institution of a Reichstag fire type move. I think if there were to be one, and if there were to be a response from Trump like Hitler's response to the Reichstag fire, you would probably get what you always seem to get. Trump's base would enthusiastically support, but 2/3 of the country would not, and then we would be into a rather unpredictable situation as to what would happen after that. As a side note on the question of historical precedents, one of the interesting things I learned in researching my book is that Germans in 1933 already had this model in their minds of how something like a terrorist attack could be a precedent for some kind of crackdown. So if we were having this conversation in Germany in 1933, somebody might ask me, is this our Sarajevo moment? Because the precedent of an assassination that could lead to a policy outcome you want was known to pretty much everybody from the experience of the assassination at Sarajevo in 1914. Or Germans might also reach back to the late 1870s when there were 2 assassination attempts against Kaiser Wilhelm I, which allowed the Chancellor Otto von Bismarck a pretext to crack down on the Social Democratic Party. So that model again. And Germans actually did make reference to that in 1933. And indeed, interestingly, I think, before the Reichstag fire, in the weeks before the Reichstag fire, there were rumors all over Germany, especially in politically informed circles, that something like that was coming, that a Sarajevo moment or a Kaiser Wilhelm I moment was coming. The Nazis were going to do that as a tool to enable a crackdown. The United States in 2025 is a very, very different country from Germany in 1933. It's much bigger, it's more complicated, it's more diverse. Particularly, it has very diverse power centers. There is a cultural ethos, I think, which cuts very sharply against authoritarianism. There's a lot of social science research to suggest that Americans are the most fundamentally individualistic people in the world on sort of every level of politics and family relations and what have you. And I think people like that are rather difficult to regiment. There is kind of a cult of the Constitution and of the values of the Constitution, particularly things like the First Amendment. And I think we saw that a couple weeks ago with the affair over the late-night talk show host. The response, even from rather surprising right-wing people about Jimmy Kimmel being sacked, was, I think, revealing of that, to a great degree, cross-partisan cult of the rights of the Constitution and the First Amendment. So I think that is a bit of an insulation against some of what Trump might do, although I do not want to venture out so far as to prophesy that. So I think we're just fine, because that's not what I'm saying. But I do think that there are countervailing forces that Trump is encountering and will encounter more. Finally, Trump and his people are very, very, very far from Hitler and the Nazis. In most ways that we could think about this, that is good news. I mentioned earlier that I thought Hitler was a fairly consequential planner, also a pretty cunning political operator, with a number of skills. Historians are often, I think, quite reluctant, understandably so, to give Hitler credit for anything. But I do think, looking at the case, honestly, you would have to say Hitler had some surprising skills. He could read people very well, both individually and in groups. He could read what people wanted to hear from him, and then he had the acting skills to deliver it. He was very cunning about timing of political moves. He had nerves to wait until the opponent was in a bad position. All of this is not true of Trump, who I think is just dumb as a sack of hammers. And shoots himself in the foot practically every time he opens his mouth. That's a really bad mixed metaphor. I apologize for that, but you get the idea. Even tactically, he usually can't help himself. He is driven, I think, mostly by the world's biggest self-esteem crisis. So what he really wants is for people to say he's wonderful. This affects his relations with such diverse people as reporters for the New York Times or Vladimir Putin. He's just always looking for approval and acceptance. Hitler had elements of that, but Hitler was also a much tougher, meaner customer, to put it maybe mildly. So I don't think Trump has either the skills or the ruthlessness that are certainly an asset in consolidating an authoritarian government, nor does he have the sweeping ideological vision. Timothy Snyder wrote a piece on this, who of course is among you now. Timothy Snyder wrote a piece on this a few weeks ago, which I felt he had articulated something I'd been kind of thinking but hadn't quite articulated, that this lack of a sweeping vision means that Trump will tend to get stuck at the first stages of this kind of move for authoritarian takeover. And, you know, I think mainly what he wants to do, other than be loved and admired, is loot the treasury of every dime he can get. And that's where a good deal of his attention and energy go. So to wrap up, I think the rhymes of 1933 are partial. They are striking enough to be worrying, certainly, but not such that we should be looking around every corner for the next Horst Wessel or the next Reichstag fire. My worry is that in looking too hard at these precedents, we will miss things that we should be seeing that come in a different guise. And I can only see in a very dim glass what these might be, but I have a vague hunch they might have to do with the treatment of migrants or with economic management or something like that. There are things that we should be looking at that we won't see because we're looking too hard at the precedent. It is my hope, therefore, that we can try to use the tools that history offers to try to see what is in front of us, as I was saying at the outset, in the hopes that someday, looking back, people won't say of us that we had about the same gifts of historical recognition and of action based upon it as did Neville Chamberlain when he looked into Hitler's eyes and saw a man that would keep his word. Those are my remarks, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for your courteous attention, and I'm eager to take questions.
Please raise your hand if you have a question, and we'll have a runner on each side of the table come to you.
Thank you, Jack Cunningham. Thank you, Professor Hett. Wonderful talk. You've brought out rhymes, real and perhaps imagined, between the Reichstag fire and some of what Trump may or may not be doing. But what do you think about the one pattern which I do think is common to both Hitler and Trump and to other authoritarians, the tendency to invoke emergency powers, not just as a legal gambit, I think, but as a way of reframing what are problems manageable within the processes of normal politics as emergencies posing existential threats and requiring extraordinary exercise of government power in response.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's an important question. It's obviously something he's doing. If you've been following Trump's rhetoric about certain cities, notably Portland and Chicago, I think, I'm pretty sure that most people living in Portland or Chicago would absolutely not recognize their city from the hellhole. That's a quote that Trump describes. Or, you know, you may remember, I thought this was quite amazing. One of these fairly recent times, this might have been a couple of months ago, when Trump was meeting with Volodymyr Zelensky. And he said something, I think, to reporters about Chicago being the most dangerous place on earth. And the double take from Zelensky was priceless. I mean, you could see his shock, like, are you kidding me? And then his sort of effort to, you know, get his face back in line and, you know. So, and I think this leads me to what I think is my answer to your question, is that Trump is doing this and will do it, and it will probably get worse, I'm afraid. But it's so not compelling that I think he's going to have a lot of trouble pulling people along with him. Hitler really didn't with the Reichstag fire 1.0. The narrative was compelling enough that probably most Germans believed it. I don't think that will be true this time. How much that will manifest in politics and matter is an open question. It depends on an unpredictable balance between his willingness to use force against opponents and protesters and the willingness of Americans to protest under those circumstances. And I do not know quite how that will play out. But I do think, as a sort of clearest answer I can give to your question, Trump is doing it and will do it. I think it's somewhat unlikely to succeed in the way that the Reichstag fire did, or other comparable emergency usages did for other authoritarians.
Hi, my name is Tracy Dalglish, over here.
Sorry. Oh, yes, okay, thank you. I can hardly see with the lights here.
I just have a question about the trajectory of authoritarianism in Weimar Germany and how Ebert really sets the course with his treatment of the communists, and how the Great Depression will trigger also this move towards power to put in some solutions to the economic crisis. And then third, Hindenburg, who was sadly 88, couldn't prevent from dying, but that was the only person that could really have stopped Hitler. Just as a difference between the government of the United States and the government of Germany.
Yeah, okay, all right, let me take a stab at those. So Ebert, for people who may not know, Friedrich Ebert was the first chancellor of a democratic Germany at the end of World War I, and then pretty quickly on he became the first president of the Republic. And it fell to him to preside over what I alluded to, the violence between social democrats and communists, particularly the violence meted out by social democrats to communists, mostly through the vehicle of recruiting people who were not on their side politically to do their dirty work against the communists. This sometimes meant troops from the army. It sometimes meant volunteer groups that were called Freikorps or Free Corps. Actually, one of my earliest experiences as a student at U of T when I came back here to do my master's was that I learned about Friedrich Ebert for the first time and his revolution, and I immediately felt a certain sympathy for him. He was put in an awful position as a man of genuinely democratic and genuinely moderate temperament who wanted a Germany that would be democratic and peaceful, and in the chaos of a war that was just ending amid revolution, trying to bring soldiers home, demobilize them, stabilize the country, have free elections, draft a new constitution, et cetera, et cetera. And into this come what was called the Spartacus League, which then sort of became the Communist Party, leading a revolt against his government. And although this is sometimes an unfashionable view among German historians, I think the fault lies there with the far left and not with Ebert. Ebert was faced with the choice when he had far left uprisings against his government. He had the choice of giving up and letting them win or fighting back. And I don't think there was a third choice. So the choice he had to make was awful, but it was, as scholars of the Holocaust say, it was kind of a choiceless choice. Hindenburg. So Hindenburg's an interesting figure. Commander-in-chief of the German armies in World War I, and then elected as president of the Republic in 1925 on the death of Friedrich Ebert, and then re-elected. It was a 7-year term. He was re-elected in 1932 in an election contested by Hitler as the other main candidate, and Hindenburg, of course, won. Hindenburg, it's pretty clear what Hindenburg wanted. He wanted to move Germany away from being a democracy, and he wanted a right-wing and authoritarian government, but one that could rest on a significant popular base, because he understood, or at least the people who advised him understood, that in modern times, even a dictatorship needs some base in the population. It can't rule as an isolated clique only with violence, not for any length of time. And so Hindenburg's political project, in a way, was to find a right-wing base that could be that base for an authoritarian government that would turn away from democracy. He didn't like Hitler at first. He always called him that Bohemian private, not for Hitler's lifestyle, but he mistakenly thought that Hitler came from Bohemia, not from Upper Austria. But he eventually was persuaded, possibly blackmailed, this is a complicated story, but he was eventually persuaded to name Hitler as chancellor, but then became quite happy with him because Hitler seemed to have done what he wanted, to bring a stable right-wing government with a substantial popular base, given the Nazis' votes. So Hindenburg went to his grave feeling that his legacy was fulfilled and he would be revered as the statesman who had brought this stabilization to German politics. Sort of ironically, I think, the very thing that he went to his grave being pleased about is the thing that has permanently, indelibly, completely scotched his reputation, because now he is, of course, the man who brought Hitler into the chancellery when he didn't have to do that. And I'm sorry, the middle question, what was the middle question again?
The middle question was just really like the trajectory of authoritarianism and how that's so different in the German experience versus, the United States structure of government.
Okay. I mean, it's difficult to compare because it works so differently, and it works in such a different cultural context. I mean, as a general rule, or as a general comment, I think I would say that Germany, as it existed constitutionally in 1933, was a sort of riper, softer target for authoritarian takeover than the United States, with all its complexities of state government and different interests and a very different political culture. Probably exacerbated by the fact that the Great Depression had sapped a lot of the willingness to resist on the left. An earlier coup in 1920, a military coup against the democratic regime, had been stopped by a general strike organized by labor. But it's hard to get that to work when your unemployment rate is 40%, which is what it was more or less at the time of the Nazi takeover. And the fact that the Weimar democracy just really didn't seem to be flourishing by the early 30s also sapped the resistance. So I think those are points of difference. I think it's hard to see the exact processes that Hitler went through. I think it's hard to see that mapping onto the US thing. It would have to go differently in the United States. It would have to look different. There would have to be different steps. So I think parallels there are probably of fairly limited use.
Hi, Peter Farkas. Going back to Mr. Trump, so you said a lot of things that made me feel good, that you don't think he had the character to go forward the same way as Hitler did. What about the people behind him, like Mr. Miller and the Heritage Foundation and the Project 2025? What about the people behind him? Could they be puppeteers and Trump is the puppet?
I suspect, and I certainly have no inside knowledge of this, but I suspect that is the case. Those two gentlemen in particular, I suspect Stephen Miller and Russell Vogt. Russell Vogt is the head of something called the Congressional Budget Office, which is actually a very important financial management arm for the government. Stephen Miller is, I think, Deputy Chief of Staff is his official title, with particular responsible for migration. Both of those guys are a lot smarter than Trump. So is my cat, but but they are, and they have clear agendas, and they are vicious, and they have said very clearly that they don't want democracy. Russell Vogt has been quoted as saying, speaking to conservatives, as a conservative, there's nothing left to conserve, so we might as well burn it all down. So they are dangerous. I think the offsetting benefit, if that's the right word, I'm trying to think of a better one, but that's the bad news part. The sort of good news part is those guys couldn't get elected to safety patrol. I mean, they are so utterly lacking. Stephen Miller, super utterly lacking in the skills of a politician. So I think there's an element of the U.S. right now that's sort of a race. Can we get to the midterm elections of 26? Will they unfold as free elections? If so, I think the Democrats will do well, and that will mitigate a lot of this. Can we then get to 28 and have a real presidential election, which probably the Democrats would win as far as I can see right now? Or will these guys be able to institute an unfixable authoritarian regime before that happens? And they are clearly trying to do that, Miller and Vogt in particular. J.D. Vance, vice president, probably to an extent as well. But all of them suffer from the same defect, that they're not going to be plausible frontmen for any kind of regime. So, if we could get to 28 and Trump is going to be gone. One of the things I don't worry about, by the way, is that he will run again. I don't see a successor. I don't see a successor that has Trump's peculiar mixture of qualities that, for reasons that utterly escape my comprehension, are compelling to his political base. There have been other people in American politics who have tried to do what Trump is doing, and they've all failed. And I don't think anyone who is a likely successor to him right now has whatever it is that Trump has that can be compelling to the MAGA base. So I think if we can sort of somehow squeeze through these next few years, we might more or less make it. And as nasty as those two guys are, I'm not sure they'll have time to do all the damage they would like to do.
Hello. Is very nervous to ask a question to a Harvard professor, so let me just...
Well, I'm a Harvard graduate, but not a Harvard professor. But thanks anyway.
Okay, so you said during for the election in 1930 and 1933 or something like that, you said like a lot of German citizens were humiliated by the war, and as well as the Treaty of Versailles and things like that. And to be honest, what I believe right now in the Donald Trump is that he is threatening the he is saying that the United States is in threat by the illegal immigrants, a lot of people like that. So I personally believe that Donald Trump is also humiliating their citizen to vote him, as well as the Republican Party. Do you still believe that United States would not have an authoritarian government if people and citizens in the United States is getting humiliated by that?
So my take on that is, I think humiliation, a sense of humiliation that many Americans feel, is the oxygen for Trump in the way that it was the oxygen for Hitler. But as time goes on, a lot of what Trump is doing is proving to be highly unpopular. And if you follow the opinion polls, you will know that, to me, rather surprisingly, even on the question of immigration, Trump is now net negative in approval, the thing that's always been his strongest issue. I think that has a lot to do with the brutality of ICE in dealing with the people they are trying to round up or are rounding up. So I think there's a sort of maybe notion that supporters of Trump had about how things would be, which is beginning to collide with the reality of how things are, which may be starting to undo a bit of the effect of that oxygen of humiliation that consolidated his voting bloc. I think we may see more of this. Sooner or later, it seems to me, the inflationary effects of his moronic tariffs are going to have to start biting. Companies have been eating that for now, but I don't think they can go on doing that. And there seem to be no trade deals coming anytime soon with China, or certainly with Canada. So I think we're going to start seeing more severe inflation. And I think if there's any lesson from the last year or so of Biden's term, that could be quite toxic to Trump's approval levels and popularity, and quite toxic to the electoral fortunes of Republicans. Or at least this is what I tell myself if I'm going to get on a plane and fly back there tomorrow instead of staying with you nice people. So I do think that the humiliation factor has had its effects, but I think we may start to see a lessening of it in the light of other things.
Yes, my name is Wojtek Schemberg. My question is this. I agree with you that Donald Trump is not smart enough to be a successful fascist. But does he have a soul of a fascist? Is that in itself a quality, a mark of a man that appeals to other people in America, and not just in America, who in a sense look for a leader. They don't look for democracy. They look for a leader who knows how to intimidate and how to exercise power.
I think The Soul of a Fascist sounds like a great title for a book. I'm now thinking, I've got to think of something I can write that has that as a title, because that's such a great, I love that concept. So I actually think, yes, I think I'm in agreement with the drift of your question. I think, among other things, I have a lot of issues with the use of the term fascism as an actual precise social science descriptor, because, as I'm sure some of you know, the definition of it is so contested. Many, many brilliant scholars who have written about what fascism is all have their own definitions, which often are quite different and even mutually exclusive from one another. I think possibly the smartest is by the Columbia historian Robert Paxton, who wrote a book called The Anatomy of Fascism about 20 years ago, which I think is a really smart book on what fascism is. But the problem is Professor Paxton's definition of fascism takes about half a page. And so I think it's hard to think of a definition that takes half a page that's really super useful in terms of analyzing a concept. That said, whatever fascism may be, I actually agree with you that I think Trump has the soul of it. I'm sure he's not smart enough to know that. Or smart enough is probably the wrong word. I mean, Trump doesn't read things or know things. He doesn't know theoretical political things. I suspect he has absolutely zero idea that he is a fascist, but he is, with all due deference to the fact that I don't love the term, he gets there instinctively. And the way you put it, I think, is lovely. He gets there instinctively because I think he does have the soul of a fascist. He just gets there somehow by himself. You know, when people say, oh, he had Hitler's speeches at his bedside table and he read them, I don't believe that for a second. The guy doesn't read. He doesn't read anything, nothing. And Hitler's super boring, you know? Like, you know, I read Hitler's stuff because it's sort of my job, but it's really boring. So I wouldn't be doing that for fun. I'm quite sure he doesn't either. He watches TV. I mean, he doesn't read anything. They give him briefing memos that are a page, and that's too much for him. But I think you see in his actions, you know, I thought there was a really interesting moment towards the end of his first term. You remember when he had COVID, and then he came out of the hospital, and he did this thing where he got on the steps of the White House and sort of took off his mask and kind of posed with his jaw sticking out, looking just like Mussolini. And I thought, here's a guy who doesn't know anything, I'm sure, about Mussolini, but he's instinctively got there. He's sort of channeling him anyway. So, you know, he is going to try to do those things, and he is doing these things. He wants to be an authoritarian. He wants to be a dictator. There's elements of his politics which are, you know, highly racist, which is a core, I think, element of fascism. He always is demonizing the left, which is, in Professor Paxton's definition of this, very core to fascism. He makes the point that it emerges largely in reaction to the Russian Revolution as an anti-Marxist, anti-communist, and racist ideology. Trump has all that sort of instinctively, I think, without actually knowing that he's got that.
Hello, my name is Tate. You've said that the ramifications, right here, you've said that the ramifications for the Reichstag fire were based around Hitler's control of the media. In a media landscape such as our own, where producers are consumers and vice versa, consumers are producers, do you think it's possible for these types of singular social events to have the same impact as the Reichstag fire did?
Theoretically, yes, in some ways, but probably not in the way that would maybe matter the most, which is securing really broad agreement with the premise, that this is a threat that's coming from Group X. The response has to be the targeting and repression of Group X. It's very hard for me to imagine any scenario in the United States now, with all the social media and everything else, in which any such thing could compel very broad agreement. Certainly among one base or the other, depending which way, you know, which foot the shoe was on. But, you know, this is why I speculated about this a little bit in my talk. It's hard for me to imagine a Reichstag fire type scenario unfolding that way in America now, at least with anything like the same effect, which isn't to say they might not try it. They might very well. And in a way, some of the emergency language that Trump is using is tracking, you know, a key element of the whole Reichstag fire scenario. But as someone suggested earlier, this is pretty common to most authoritarians. And again, would it work in the sense of persuading a substantial majority of Americans that the government narrative was actually true? It's hard for me to imagine that being so, especially right now, actually, given that Trump's popularity has fallen so much so quickly, that, you know, I think the number of voters who are willing to grant him sort of benefit of the doubt is probably much lower now than it was even in January, at least. Again, this may be optimistic, this may be overly optimistic on my part, but that's sort of how it looks to me right now.
This will be our last question.
Hi. My question is with regards to something you said earlier about how we're seeing a rise in right-wing leaders and their potential to get elected in all over the world, in Europe, so general rise in right-wing ideology. And I wanted to ask where else you are seeing these sorts of striking parallels and what we can learn from your work on Hitler's Germany about current rise of right-wing ideology in places other than the United States.
Yeah, thanks for that. So I actually think in a broader sense, the time we're living in right now really tracks the interwar years, the 20s and the 30s, maybe especially the 30s, and in this international sense, in that there's been a somewhat similar sequence. To shamelessly plug this, my book, The Nazi Menace, makes this argument for anyone who might be curious. You look at the end of World War I and the peace settlement after World War I, you've got a real democratic moment which sweeps across a lot of the world, particularly Central and Eastern Europe, a little bit in East Asia. And you've got countries becoming, in some cases, independent, and then in some cases becoming democracies that hadn't been before. And to me, that looks a little bit like 1989 to 1991, where you had some of the same processes in, to a great degree, the same places. And then the sort of tide going the other way also looks a lot the same. Then you see a lot of these democracies falling into authoritarianism, or at least semi-authoritarianism. And that sort of, you know, euphoric democratic movement really starts to recede, and you get right-wing authoritarian challenges to those democracies. And it is tempting, I think, to think that a lot of the causal mechanism might be the same, and I suspect a lot of it is. I think some combination of, you know, the world of the, I'm getting into Professor MacMillan's territory here big time, but, you know, the world of the peace conference in Paris, the world that created, was in some ways a very globalist world with an agenda of not only democracy but open trade. When the League of Nations imposed, I think it's the right word, minority treaties, as they called them, on a lot of the Eastern European countries, they included in them provisions about trade, which shows a little bit of what the agenda was, I think, for especially the Western capitalist democracies. You get a nationalist backlash against this. I mean, I talked about this specifically here tonight for Germany, but you see this phenomenon in a lot of countries. There's a nationalist backlash against this sort of globalization that's happening. And you get a kind of populist backlash against the economic hard times of the 1930s. Again, to cite Professor Paxton in his book on fascism, I think he put it very well. You get into a situation by the early 30s in which liberal economics, capitalist economics, could only be imposed in a lot of these countries with authoritarian politics, because people wouldn't vote for them anymore. They're looking for different options. And this ends up being oxygen to a lot of the authoritarian parties that start, or authoritarian movements, that start taking power in those regions. So all of that, I think, tracks on today in some ways. I think all of that tracks a bit onto, you know, if you look at the AfD in Germany, you look at the National Rally in France, you look at Reform in the UK, I think in many ways they're all sort of channeling the same kinds of arguments in response to the same kind of phenomena. One caveat here, I read a fascinating piece a little while ago, which almost, for someone who lives in the United States, was disturbing, but it's maybe better news if you're in Germany or France. That some really extensive survey of the attitudes of voters in a lot of European countries, voters for the far-right parties, found that if you do a big survey of their basic attitudes to all kinds of things, life and politics and so on, you find that they are actually a lot more like American Democrats than MAGA voters. In other words, even the European voters for some of the far-right parties are actually in their basic ethos much less extreme than MAGA people. So like I say, I have very mixed feelings about that finding, but I think it's interesting. And it may be, this may sound crazy, but there may be slightly good news for Europe. I mean, maybe what this means is you'll get governments like Meloni's in Italy, which, you know, it's a right-wing government, but it's not unmitigatedly horrible. I think she's at least in the right place on Ukraine, as far as I can tell. So, you know, I mean, maybe that's what's coming in Europe. Maybe nothing quite as lurid as Donald Trump. But now I'm venturing into the thing that Professor MacMillan warned us last night not to do, which is make predictions on history. So maybe I should just stop right there and let it go. Thank you. My last duty is to welcome Professor MacMillan up to the stage for a few concluding remarks. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for your kind attention.
It's terrific. It's terrific. Thank you. Well, I think after that, I can't make any concluding remarks except to say that I'm very sorry the questions came to an end and your talk came to an end. It was fascinating. It was both dismaying and also encouraging, and has made us, I think, all think about the past, about how the past can help cast light or not on the present. You've given us a wonderful evening, and we have a lot to talk about. And I'm very pleased, if I took this one personal note, to have a lectureship like this named after me. So often when heads of colleges leave, they call a horrible little broom cupboard somewhere after them. And this is certainly my college at Oxford has done this. So to have a lecture with such content and to have such a wonderful series of lectures is really an honor, and I'm absolutely delighted. And congratulations again to you for giving us such a wonderful evening, and congratulations to the audience for their clear engagement and for their questions. If you want to go on discussing this, Trinity has provided what I'm told are ample snacks at the back, which you've got fuel for thought now, and we've given you a little bit of fuel to keep you going while you discuss it. So again, congratulations. Thank you so much, Professor Hett. It was a wonderful evening. Thank you.